its constituent parts. It is not, at its core, about what people can or cannot do, what entitlements they may have once they move from one part to another. So it's just about moving. It doesn't tell you what they can do once they've moved. However, there are a number of bilateral arrangements between the UK and the Republic of Ireland associated with the Common Travel Area, and these also perhaps tend to point to a certain sense of discomfort on the UK's part in relation to its membership of the EU, or perhaps a greater propensity to view Irish citizens as less alien than those from other EU member states. In essence, this translates into the fact, for example, Irish citizens in the UK are treated as being habitually resident for some social welfare benefits, which means that unlike citizens from other EU member states, they are automatically eligible. So you can be Portuguese, whatever, an EU citizen, but Irish citizens are automatically eligible for some social welfare rights. Other EU citizens have to have a certain period of residence, but this is related to the Common Travel Area. It's a separate arrangement, and this is part of the kind of confusion that arises in terms of what is the Common Travel Area, what does it actually stand for. The distinction between Irish citizens and those from other EU member states is manifest in the UK government's approach to the current negotiations with the EU over its departure. And if the government's proposals become a post-Brexit reality, we may anticipate much of the burden of managing this distinction falling on employers and the providers of public services, including local authorities and institutions of higher education, for example. Crucially, by shifting management and control of non-Irish EU migration to the UK to employers and public service providers, the government may avoid the need to impose controls at the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in relation to the movement of people, if not to the movement of goods. So a lot of this about managing migration in terms of Brexit, it's a lot to do with how do you keep the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland open. So in order not to control the movement of people, they're going to start looking at ways of managing migration that move to public service providers. So the UK government's position paper setting out its proposals on the post-Brexit rights of EU citizens in the UK and of UK nationals in the EU not only makes clear that the principle of free movement of people will no longer apply, but also how the operation of future immigration policy is likely to be implemented. For EU citizens living in the UK at the point at which the UK leaves the EU, the process they must follow if they wish to remain includes completing a period of 5 years continuous residence before applying for what is termed settled status. And if successful, they will be issued with a residence document. Acquisition of this document is not just a legal requirement, but as the government argues, it also has an important practical reason. And this is the practical reason here. The residence, so this is from the document itself, the residence document will enable EU citizens and their families living in the UK to demonstrate to third parties, such as employers or providers of public services, that they have permission to continue to live and work legally in the UK. Following the UK's exit from the EU, the government may wish to introduce controls which limit the ability of EU citizens and their families who arrive in the UK after exit to live and work here. As such, without a residence document, current residents may find it difficult to access the labour market and services. So here, the role of employers and public service providers in ensuring that non-qualifying EU citizens do not access the labour market and services is clear. Of course, this isn't an entirely unfamiliar role, as many of you will be aware, including those within academic institutions, as the government already requires monitoring of access to employment and services and denial of that access to non-EU citizens who do not qualify. The novelty lies in the fact that EU citizens will now face equivalent hurdles and restrictions as their status is fundamentally changed in the post-Brexit context, and employers and service providers will have to administer a larger constituency. However, irrespective of the Republic of Ireland's continuing membership of the European Union and whatever the future path chosen by the United Kingdom, Irish citizens will not be included in that constituency and are spared the need to apply for settled status or acquire a residence document. So they're Irish citizens, they're still EU citizens, but they are placed apart. This is made clear from the outset of the UK government's paper on citizens' rights, which begins by affirming that its proposals in this area are, quote, without prejudice to common travel area arrangements between the UK and Ireland and the rights of British and Irish citizens in each other's countries rooted in the Ireland Act 1949, end of quote, before it goes on to make the assurance that, quote, Irish citizens residing in the UK will not need to apply for settled status to protect their entitlements, end of quote. I would argue that this distinction speaks of a British capacity to divorce the UK's membership of the EU from the idea of EU citizenship. So it's this idea that the UK still is part of the EU, but somehow this idea of EU citizenship, that's a funny thing that we're not quite... We've never really latched onto the fact that we are also, we're not just British citizens that are part of the EU, we are also citizens of the EU. We've never been comfortable with that. So it's then able to transpose this approach onto Irish citizens, whose own continuing EU citizenship is not seen as an obstacle to offering them preferential treatment over fellow EU citizens in the post-Brexit context. So membership of the EU is we've never really felt as EU citizens, so Ireland being part of the EU and therefore their citizens being part of the EU, we can just forget the fact that they're also EU citizens like other EU citizens, so we can continue to treat them in a different way. I would also add that in turn, this attitude means the notion of migrant is more readily applied to those entering the UK from countries other than Ireland, and perhaps even more so when we include attitudes to social class or type of economic activity, in other words, the distinction between skilled and unskilled labour, as well as race and religion. But returning to the theme of individual sectors or regions within the UK searching for mitigations or opportunities as they face the challenges presented by Brexit, I have to note that we in the Centre for Cross-Border Studies have also made use of the distinction applied to Irish citizens as we have formulated our own proposals. Thus, for example, our October 2016 submission to the House of Lords inquiry and a subsequent evidence to that committee into Brexit and their inquiry into Brexit and UK-Irish relations, in our submission we anticipated the possibility of the introduction of administrative procedures to control migration, as we suggested how the nature not only of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland could be preserved, continue to be open, but also that between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. So we want to keep our border on the island of Ireland open, but we also don't want to, in order to maintain that open border, to create a different one between Northern Ireland and Scotland, England and Wales. So this is what we said in our evidence. In terms of movement of non-Irish EU citizens across the Ireland-Northern Ireland border, there may be no need to establish permanent passport control posts. Instead, an approach could be taken that would permit the entry of non-Irish EU citizens into Northern Ireland from the Republic of Ireland in the knowledge that those who do so without the requisite entitlement will not legally be able to reside, seek employment, study, or gain access to social welfare and healthcare services or benefits. Moreover, in order to avoid the political instability that would be caused in Northern Ireland if any passport controls were to be imposed that would be discriminatory in nature between UK citizens, this approach could be extended to movement of non-Irish EU citizens from Northern Ireland into other parts of the United Kingdom. Although in our defence, the Centre for Cross-Border Studies has expressed elsewhere its concerns over the post-Brexit rights of non-Irish EU citizens, here, in this submission, we appear to have thrown them overboard as we seek to keep afloat the raft of the Common Travel Area and its associated bilateral arrangements between the UK and Ireland, which contribute to the openness of our border. So we're here arguing, in order to maintain our border open, we'll actually make use of this distinction between Irish citizens who are EU citizens and other EU citizens. But as I said, we have argued elsewhere for rights for non-Irish EU citizens. To complicate matters further, and without entering into any detail given the time we have, even with what we see as the likelihood of the Northern Ireland border remaining open to the movement of people, there's the question of what rights some people gain and lose as they move across it. So you can keep them, no passport controls needed. As you move across that border, what rights are you gaining, what rights do you lose? So hopefully you're familiar with the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, which marked the end of the conflict in Northern Ireland. That agreement guaranteed the right of those in Northern Ireland to identify themselves as British, Irish, or both. So if you're in Northern Ireland, part of the 1998 peace agreement meant I, from Northern Ireland, can say I am British and have a British passport, or I can say I'm Irish. So I'm in Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, but I can say I'm Irish, have an Irish passport, or I can say I am both. I am both British and Irish. So that's part of the peace agreement in 1998. With the prospect of Brexit, we're now confronted with the as yet unresolved question as to how those living in Northern Ireland but with Irish and therefore EU citizenship can access their full EU rights. Without resolution, this could lead to a situation where those from Northern Ireland would potentially gain and lose rights as they move back and forth across the Irish border, depending on whether they self-identify as Irish or British. This would do nothing to contribute to the state of social cohesion within Northern Ireland, which could be further threatened if migrants became post-Brexit scapegoats for any economic downturn caused by the UK's departure from the EU. And I can't emphasise strongly enough, in terms of social cohesion, that is a real problem in Northern Ireland. So you've got the divisions between nationalists and unionists, or Protestants and Catholics, which we have to manage, and this is just going to complicate matters further. And this issue of what rights do I gain and lose depending on whether I, from Northern Ireland, identify as Irish or British. If I identify as Irish, I have certain rights as an EU citizen. My next door neighbour from Northern Ireland might identify as British, has different rights. For instance, on the same street, live next door to each other, born in the same place, and I, as an Irish citizen, claiming Irish citizen, I might not even have left Northern Ireland at all, and yet I am an EU citizen because of my Irish citizenship. Now, as I'm talking about migrants, it's perhaps important to give a bit of context here. So according to the last census, the 2011 census, 11%, 202,000 people thereabout, of Northern Ireland's total population of just over 1.8 million were born outside Northern Ireland. Of those, 2.5%, or just over 45,000, were from EU countries other than the Republic of Ireland, with the majority coming from countries that joined the EU after 2004, so Eastern European countries. So if we take that as a comparison, then so 2011, 2.5% are from EU countries other than the Republic of Ireland living in Northern Ireland. By comparison, in the census before that in 2001, so just 3 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, less than 1% of the Northern Ireland population came from EU countries other than the Republic of Ireland. So we've had a huge increase in terms of migration from EU countries other than the Republic of Ireland in that period. And just to note, I've also put here, so you've seen an increase here in terms of migration. This census here, the 1991 census, the categories don't even make sense. Here what we have in that census were people born in Northern Ireland, people living in Northern Ireland were born in Great Britain or the Republic of Ireland, and then all the rest were bunched together as people from Commonwealth countries and other, all bunched together. It's also important to note that migration was extremely important to Northern Ireland. So you see this spike going from after the